My name's Philip Griffiths, also known as Griff. I'm a vegetable breeder, and I'm based at the Geneva station, which is about an hour north of here. In fact, at this point in time, I'm the only full-time vegetable breeder left at Cornell. For those of you who haven't had the chance to visit Geneva yet, it's about an hour drive up between Cayuga and Seneca Lakes. It sits right on the top of Seneca Lake. Geneva's a town of about 20,000. The station has about 300 or so employees in 4 sister departments with the Ithaca main campus. So it has about 45 research programs. We don't have a department of plant breeding there. We do have a department of horticulture, which is where I'm based, right in this building here. So I'm basically in the field of horticulture and the field of plant breeding. So my teaching responsibilities are in the field of plant breeding. As I said, there's about 45 programs, but we also have the USDA site here, which holds germplasm or living tissue for breeding purposes, mostly fruit and vegetable crops. And aside from myself, there's 3 fruit breeders based at the station, one working on grapes, one on berry crops, one on apples. And there's another 2 breeders at the USDA station that work on rootstocks. So the focus of the station is really on horticultural crops. And I'm going to be covering 6 lectures over the next 2 weeks. And it's really going to kind of be more focused in that area, because a lot of the time when you go through these breeding classes, they have the tendency to really focus on the big 4, which are like corn, wheat, cotton, soybean, or whatever. A lot of what you'll actually hit when you come to work with crop plants, though, you'll find there's many, many more species that are cultivated for human consumption than the big field crops. And there's a lot of different traits and a lot of different foci in breeding programs associated with these. Some of you, I think, probably do work with horticultural crops. When you hit breeding classes, you tend to see these kinds of graphs, which tells you the wonderful job that breeding has done since hybrid creation in the 1930s, and then the massive increases in yield that have been seen post-war. These, of course, aren't solely to do with breeding. A lot of it is to do with cultural practices, fertilization, just crop production generally. Because if you take some of these earlier varieties that were grown in the 1940s and grow them up here in 2000, they're not going to do as well as today's varieties, but they're still going to do pretty well. So breeding is oftentimes accredited for maybe close to 50% of the gains in some of these yield crops. But with a lot of these agronomic crops, yield really becomes the central issue. If you ask growers what 3 factors are most important, it's yield, yield, and yield is oftentimes the answer. So a lot of breeding can tend to focus on just how you actually increase the yield of the crop. Maybe secondarily to that, then you have areas such as pest resistance. You can see that this guy over here is a little bit less concerned about chemicals than these other guys. But it's not just on the basis of the environmental side of reducing chemical input, but a lot of it is, of course, to reduce or prevent a lot of epidemics that you get through a lot of these diseases that can really come into grow in areas with the type of monoculture that we have. Oftentimes, there'll be just a small number of diseases that are really focused on particular crop plants. And so when you work on any particular crop species or any market class of a crop, oftentimes there'll be 2 or 3 disease resistance genes that are very, very important for that particular crop. If you work with tomato, for instance, you really want to introduce, say, the verticillium and the fusarium gene into it and test them at the seedling stage. Another thing that growers like is early maturity. This is based on a few factors. One is that the growers like to have materials in the field for as short a time as possible. When you have fields and materials in the field for a shorter time, you obviously have less inputs and you put yourself at less risk. But early maturing crops can also get through the season such that they beat out disease epidemics and the epidemiology of diseases, particularly in the northern states. A lot of diseases will tend to come from the south that are killed out by winter. And if you have an early maturing crop, you can actually go through and harvest that crop before the diseases really hit and become a major problem. This is why, for instance, barley suffers a lot less from stem rust in the Red River Valley than wheat, because it's got a shorter maturity than wheat typically. But I'm really here to talk more about horticulture, and sometimes it's surprising how many people get to the level of graduate study in plant breeding and they don't really know what horticulture actually is. But that it is true that that situation does exist. If you break down the Latin, hortus means garden. So this differs from arga, field, or forestus, forest. So when you're talking about horticulture, you're really talking about garden culture. Horticulture is a highly intensive production of crops. The reason for this is that horticultural crops are harvested fresh or as living tissue. So basically when you're dealing with horticulture, you're dealing with the living. When you're dealing with commodity crops, you're dealing with the dead and dying, basically. So when you're dealing with fresh market crops, you have a lot of issues that come into play beyond simply just the yields, some traits that maybe will help with machine harvesting, maturity, disease resistance, etc. So I want to try and cover some of these during the 6 lectures, but today I'm just going to give just a little bit of an overview of fruits and vegetables, which are the horticultural crops, and maybe some of the oddities that you may see in these that necessitate a more perhaps unique or different approach than you might take with some field crops. Horticulture is typically split into 4 different sections. Edible horticulture is going to comprise 2 of them, which are going to be vegetables and the fruits and nuts. But horticulturally, we also have landscape, architecture, which will cover, for instance, golf courses, parks, urban horticulture, and ornamentals, which are going to cover your flowers, your bedding plants, this kind of area. So really horticulture is split into 4 different groups. The only groups I'm going to cover are going to be the edible horticultural areas of vegetables and fruits. So what are some of the things that make horticultural crops more unique or different from some of the big grain crops? Well, one of the biggest factors is the qualitative issues that you have to deal with fresh market crops. We also have started to use the term now specialty crops, referring to horticultural crops. It used to use minor crops and major crops, when major crops were corn, etc. But as I said, with a lot of the field crops, you're dealing with a lot of quantitative issues, such as yield, seed size, for instance. with fruits and vegetables, the qualitative issues really become almost more important than the yield capacity in many ways, because there's a much greater degree of consumer choice, for instance, when they're going out and deciding what apple to eat than when they're deciding what flour to buy, for example. So based on this, the qualitative issues, the cost really increases significantly. The inputs are much, much higher than in field crops, but the value per acre can be 10, 20, 30 times what it can for a field crop, depending on the type of fresh market crop you're growing. So while you may look at the national acreage and say, well, there's 80 million acres of corn planted last year, that's probably more acres than all the horticultural crops put together. But the value of corn is very, very low. If you actually take the edible grain crops and you actually take their dollar value and then you add up all of the horticultural crops, then you actually end up with similar levels. A lot of the grain crops, of course, go for animal feed, for example. In fact, if you ever have a chance to look at the USDA national statistics and you look at the top 100 crop plants, you'll find that about 90 of them are horticultural. So while we do have these major grain crops provide a large portion of the carbohydrates in the world's diet, there are a lot of specialty crops out there. And so the investment is obviously much, much lower because you're not going to get the type of investment in something like artichokes that you're going to get in something like soybean. You also have a little bit of an overlap between this fresh market and this commodity type of area when you talk about horticulture. So for instance, snap beans and dry beans, which are two crops I work with, are both the same species. But snap beans or green beans are harvested fresh to eat as the green pods, where the dry beans, such as red kidneys, black beans, are actually dried down, bagged, and then they're basically marketed as a commodity crop because they will have the storage that fresh market won't. So even though they're the same species, they can really be looked at differently just depending on the time of harvest, whether you harvest the pod or you harvest the seeds. This may also be true for things such as sweet corn, which can be considered a horticultural crop compared to field corn, an agronomic crop, and perhaps mustard greens, for example, if you just harvest in the leaves of mustards. So you can kind of have, the same species can kind of fall into two types of groups depending on what part of the plant you're actually harvesting or what stage you're actually harvesting the plant. This is a picture of one of our farms in Geneva from this year, actually. So this is where we're just starting to set up our field plots, for example. I work with vegetables. Most of the materials we put out this year, we put on a raised plastic mulch. So you can see this is the Gates farm, and here we've laid about, I think about 55 400-foot rows of plastic. So you can see just the initial investment in the rows with the cost of the drip tape, the plastic, the fertilizer, just before you start is much, much higher than just plowing the field, applying herbicides and fertilizer. Vegetables require a lot less space to breed in, of course, than fruit crops. The station at Geneva has about 750 to 800 acres of property, or about 300 hectares. But a lot of this is because we have a lot of research that goes on in apple trees. And obviously, the number of apple trees you can put in an acre or a hectare is much, much lower than in vegetables. But setting up the plots like this, it allows us to bring a lot of uniformity, even in a very unpredictable climate like New York, because we're able to move in liquid fertilizer through the drip tapes. We're able to control the fertilization, the irrigation, and also with some of the unpredictable weather here, the raised beds prevent the waterlogging of plants in low spots that you get in the uneven fields that we get in this area. Vegetables as a whole, if you look at the production within the US, are mostly focused around California, particularly the Salinas Valley down here south of the Bay Area. We have Arctic weather will come down the west coast of the US. It'll get kind of trapped in this Bay Area of California. And this cool weather will actually channel itself down through the Salinas Valley like an enormous air conditioner going down through the back of California. This basically creates a growing environment that makes it perfect for vegetable production. So a lot of the country's vegetables are basically grown in the Salinas and Sacramento Valley areas of California, particularly lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, all of these kinds of crops. They do move up and down between Salinas and Sacramento Valley a little bit depending on the season. In the wintertime, you're going to be more in the Salinas Valley and in the Sacramento Valley, which is the more desert-like region. Where in the summertime, when you have this cooling effect, you're going to be in the Salinas Valley. But the production here is enormous. Processing tomatoes alone are probably about $1 billion. We also have a lot of winter production of vegetables in southern Florida here. In particular, fresh market tomatoes. A lot of the large green pick tomatoes you get in the stores are going to be coming out of the Homestead area in southern Florida. The tomato industry here is also worth about $1 billion. A lot of other crops grown in Florida, even things like potatoes. And they'll be grown in the wintertime, of course, where you don't get the frosts, and then they'll be shipped up north. You can also see that we have some growing areas around Oregon, Washington, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. And then if you look at New York, you can see that western New York is the primary growing area of New York. It's not anywhere near as important as it may have been 50 or 100 years ago, when New York agriculture at that point was far more important and a lot more land was in agriculture. To look at dry beans alone, which is a crop that I worked with 50 years ago, 300,000 acres were planted in New York State. Now we have about 15,000 acres planted per year, which is about 5% of what we had 50 years ago. But it is still quite important to western New York, where you have quite a lot of rural type of towns and communities. I think New York ranks about 5th or 6th in vegetable production on a state basis. Just to give you a little bit of a background of New York, because you are here and you are working here and where vegetables stand. They're basically, off the farm, they're worth about $500 million. But of course, if you get to the store, this is going to multiply maybe 4, 5, 6-fold in value going to the consumer, but also the value when you move it into processed products, the restaurant trade, etc. The food industry starts to become much more important than the off-the-farm level. If you look at the farm value in New York State, it's worth about $3.5 billion coming off the farm. But you have to take this into account from where we stand as a state and the financial markets, the property markets, the business that's actually done in this state and in and around the city. And when we have a 2005 gross domestic product of $1 trillion and agriculture is worth about 0.5% of the total New York output. But it is still very important for upstate New York, and it is still very important in its follow-on effects in things like the restaurant and food industry. But we should take this into account on a state basis when we look at perhaps how consequential our work is and how important the work in New York is. But Cornell, of course, is not just breeding for New York State, it's breeding for the US and the world. As far as vegetables grow, the main crops are snap bean, cabbage, sweet corn, potatoes, and onions. I work on brassica crops, including cabbage and broccoli, and I also work on common bean. So I work on snap bean, but I also work a little bit on dry beans, which are like red kidney and black beans, which are actually starting to improve. And I'm doing some consumer breeding in tomatoes for color and shape for novel types. Some of you may have seen some of this if you visited Geneva. But this is basically the breakdown of New York vegetable production. It's also, if you look at production, it's been increasing in fresh market in the last 5 to 10 years, which is a good sign. Hopefully people are buying more fresh produce than frozen and canned. So processing is maybe on a slight decline, where fresh market certainly has been on an increase, particularly fresh market sweet corn, fresh market snap beans, been doing very well in New York for the last 5 or 10 years. A lot of people start talking about what is a vegetable and what is a fruit. A lot of people, is tomato a fruit or a vegetable? If you go back to the 1800s, before we really started to kind of break down scientifically what things are, people used to consider a vegetable as something you eat during your meal and a fruit as something you eat after your meal, which is not particularly scientific. Now, a fruit, if you were to speak to a botanist, is a ripened ovary. When the pistil is fertilized by the pollen, the ovules go on to produce the seeds, and then the ovary goes on to ripen to produce the fruit. So the ovules will produce the seeds in a tomato, the ovary the fruit. But as breeders or horticulturalists, we're looking at things from the production standpoint. And what and how do we differentiate between a fruit and a vegetable? Well, a vegetable we would typically consider as something that is seed propagated, grown as an annual, and has a fleshy leaf type. So when you get out there into industry, if you go and pick up a job as a watermelon breeder, you are going to be considered a vegetable breeder. And if you look up in a horticultural textbook, a watermelon is a vegetable because of the production method, even though botanically it is a fruit. Because if you think about the ripening of the flower, you can't judge it just simply based on whether it's sweet or not, like they did 200 years ago. Because all crops, like many vegetable crops, like eggplant and squash, all of these are produced from ripened ovaries. They just don't happen to be sweet, so people think they're vegetables. If something is sweet, like a melon, they think it must be a fruit. Now, technically, they're all fruits, but horticulturally, they're considered vegetables. Fruit crops, from a horticultural standpoint, are going to be crops that are clonally propagated, grown as perennials, and have a woody type of stem. So they're going to be kind of your berry crops, your vine crops like grape, and then, of course, your tree crops like apple, stone fruits. Vegetable crops are mostly annual. Some are biennial, like beet, cabbage, carrot, onion. Their life cycle is biennial, but they're grown as an annual. So, for instance, a biennial is where it flowers in the second season. If you don't have too much of a frost and you leave a cabbage out throughout the winter, it will flower in its second year. But from a production standpoint, it's actually grown as an annual because it's planted as a seed and it's actually harvested in the first year. They are quite difficult crops to work with. I've worked with cabbage for almost a decade, and biennial crops are certainly more difficult than annual crops to work with. A lot of the work privately is done in seed companies. Biennial crops, most interestingly, are mostly based in Europe. I think maybe they have a little bit more patience with the crops. Where crops like melons, tomatoes, peppers in the vegetable area are much more common in the US. You can get some perennial crops like asparagus that you can keep mowing down. Yeah.
I don't understand why the biennials are harder to live with.
The biennial crops from a breeding standpoint, it's not just that you have to get through to that second year before flowering. Most of the time they're also outcrossing plants, so they're self-incompatible. With cabbage, for instance, we may seed it in May, plant it in the field in June. We'll dig it up in September. We'll have to move it into a cold room for 3 to 4 months at 40 degrees, watering it and keeping it going. We'll then bring it back into the greenhouse in the pot. We'll cut it back to the meristem. We'll lower the greenhouse. We'll get it to flower over a month's period. We have to individually bud pollinate every single flower. And then by about April time, we can finally get seeds. If I'm working with tomatoes, I can go out to the field, find a plant I want, and just pick the fruit straight off it. That's where the difficulty comes in. And a lot of the times it's very difficult to vernalize, winter vernalize, especially with onion, for example. Rhubarb is probably more of a herb than it is a vegetable, but it is another perennial. So really when we're talking about vegetables, basically it's an annual fleshy seed crop that's harvested fresh, but basically you can harvest any part of it. So if you harvest basically what you might botanically consider the fruit, it would be crops such as tomatoes, cucumbers, melons. You can harvest basically the pistil will develop into a pod, which is basically almost the entire flower kind of develops out, in the case of snap beans, for instance. Or you could even harvest the root, bulbs, tubers, greens. So basically you can harvest any part of the plant and it's considered a vegetable, irrespective of whether you harvest the root or whether you harvest the flower. And on Friday I'm going to talk about fruit crops, so I'll talk about a lot of the differences at that point between fruits and vegetables also. But as with many seed crops, the seed must be highly fertile. You've got to have really good germination without radical changes of type. In some cases you do get polyploids, which I'll talk about in a couple of weeks. But for the most part, diploids are easier to produce. And for the seed market, most seeds do tend to be diploids. I know that a lot of agronomic crops naturally are allopolyploids, such as wheat. And also because of the value, you often have seed coating or seed pelleting. So when the seed is harvested, the seed is normally, in the case of small seeds, it would be pelleted, as you can see here. In the case of large seeds like beans, it would be coated. But they're basically coated with fungicides, sometimes an antibiotic, and maybe a fertilizer or an insecticide, like gaucho. And this will really help the uniformity of the stand, and it'll prevent problems like damping off when you start growing seeds, and basically the plants die in before they even get to a week or two of maturity. Horticultural crops are considered fresh markets because they're harvested fresh, but they can also be sold in, for instance, the supermarkets as fresh market, or they can be harvested fresh and processed. So, for instance, if you go into can or freeze vegetables, this may be the case. It should be noted that the value of fresh market vegetables can be much higher than the value of processed vegetables. In the case of snap beans, which is a crop I work on, if you were growing them for the processing market, which would be for freezing or canning, you may get $600 to $1,000 an acre, depending on your yield. If you grow them for fresh market consumption, they would probably sell at $3,000 to $4,000 per acre. So the value in snap beans would be about fivefold. In some crops, it can be much bigger than that. But for processing, they tend to be grown on much larger acreage. It tends to be much more mechanized with machine harvesting, for example. So issues like uniformity, soluble solids, and the ability to can become quite important on the processing side. On the fresh market, going straight to the supermarket, issues like non-damaging during shipping and its shelf life capabilities are going to become much more important. If you look at tomatoes that are processed, like the Roma tomatoes, they're just machine harvested at the maximum uniformity, as high a level as soluble solids as possible. Fresh market tomatoes, of course, the damage can be extensive post-harvest in them. So a lot of breeding issues then have to play into the ability of a horticultural crop to be able to make it to the consumer and be able to, for instance, store and ship and still be of pretty high quality. Quality traits for the consumer start to become an issue. As I said, with field crops, they may be less important. But perhaps in the last 20, 30 years, the diversity of foods that consumers are demanding has gone up considerably. 30 years ago, you may have had 30 produce items in the supermarket. Now you may have 300, 400, 500. You may have 30 types of apples or 30 types of peppers in some large supermarkets. So consumers really respond to things like color, size, and shape, and the ability to eat it more easily, such as seedless crops, or appearance, or even how you market it. So while with breeding we always tend to focus in on, yield, resistance, adaptability, harvestability traits, a lot of these things are really based on the producer side. And perhaps, 90% of plant breeding or more in the past, particularly in field crops, is based on breeding crops for the producer and for the shipper and distributor, perhaps. The consumer is becoming much more important with specialty crops, and these markets are increasing drastically with the way that you package materials, the way that you sell them as organic grown, for example. So a lot of these kind of shape and color aesthetics are becoming more important in plant breeding. That's why I wanted to kind of run through a little bit of variation that we see in vegetables with some pictures. And I'm going to talk Monday about germplasm and where we can access that through and how we can use it in breeding also. So if you go out there and you actually start to collect biodiversity, you realize the abundance that is out there. This is just some of the colors and shapes that you might see in the background of pepper, for example. But color really has started to take off in the last maybe 10 years. People like crops that are different colors. Some of these colors are colors that have existed for a long, long time. White peaches are the natural flesh color for peaches. Yellow flesh is actually recessive to white. If you go back 200-300 years ago, people used to eat white and yellow carrots. They just disappeared off the market and everything became orange. So sometimes it's just a matter of taking a step back in history and picking back up some of these colors. But to be able to utilize them, in this case in Swiss chard, can really not just create new markets, but it can create much higher value for both the grower, the distributor, the seed seller, and everybody involved. Yeah. Yes, all vegetables are nutritious, of course, no matter which one you eat. You do tend to find that certain nutritional compounds are associated with different colors. And I think that some people have the idea of boosting nutrition in a particular crop plant. But really, if you want a balanced, nutritious diet, eat fresh produce that covers all of the colors in the supermarket, because the different colors really have higher or lower concentrations of different compounds. In carrot here, for instance, you can see some of the colors. Purple carrot is starting to become quite popular now. They're starting to get it much deeper in here. Purple haze is a new Beijing variety that's out. They like this in Texas because the football colors are purple and orange. That's where it really was brought to market a lot. Also Phil Simon in Wisconsin. But you also have, for instance, white, yellow, and then moving towards a very dark high beta-carotene type of carrot. Orange cucumber as a novel type has been worked on. This is also increasing the beta-carotene level of the vitamin A, which is always very important. Obviously, peppers and tomatoes are some of the ones that have these real drastic differences in color, shape, and size. Here you can see maybe a white tomato, a black tomato, which really starts to look a little bit like its relatives of the nightshade family, which doesn't always encourage consumers. This is actually the purplish black. This is being worked on by Jim Myers up in Oregon State. This should hit market probably in the next couple of years. I work on this a little bit also in grape tomatoes. And even the brown tomato, if you are trying to pick colors that the consumer may or may not like. So it's about knowing consumer aesthetics in some of these cases. Because sometimes the consumer will be attracted to a color, they'll look at it, but they don't fancy it, so they buy that produce item, but not in the unusual color. So it can sometimes attract consumers to the stands, for example. I've been working on grape tomatoes for the last 3 or 4 years, just trying to change up a lot of the colors. Some of you may have seen them that visited Geneva. So you can see we're just trying to move them through so you can package about 5 or 6 colors in a carton to sell them for a higher price. So these are some of the selections from this past season where you can see you go from white, yellow, elongated, orange, peach, striped, cherry, red, pink, black, black pear, blackberry. So that just in the smaller fruited stuff, that just shows some of the variation that we can actually put together to sell these items. Black chili peppers are another one that's hit the market. In America, everything seems to be about size. The bigger, the better. And these are legitimate hamburgers, apparently, somewhere in Pennsylvania. Whether anybody actually eats the whole thing, I'm not sure. The size can be based on both the producer and the consumer in vegetables. In the case of cabbage in New York State, it's grown a lot for the storage market, so it's chopped up for coleslaw at the deli counters, Kentucky Fried Chicken. But they don't like to have more than a 5-kilogram head, or about 12-pound head. It's possible to produce cabbage heads that are 8 or 9 kilograms, but when you start getting to too large a size, you have the people that work with these crops, you end up with chiropractic problems. And New York is one of the worst states in the country for workman's comp situations. So large cabbage can be good for some things. It's good if you're just producing coleslaw. These are Dominic and Sarah who work in my program. This was visited in Beijing a week or so ago, where now they're starting to come out with a whole line of individual-sized cabbages that may be about half a kilogram to a kilogram. This is a small Savoy, so you can just have it in one sitting rather than that kind of 4-pound cabbage that's more typical in the supermarkets. And then you can maybe sell them for, 59 cents a head or something. So you can actually encourage people to actually eat some of these vegetables by making it more consumer or more tailored to consumers. You can get a dwarf gene in tomatoes that dwarfs the plant, produces regular-sized fruit. This can serve as a hanging basket that you can actually eat these materials off, or you can just use it to study in tomato genetics in the laboratory, for example, with occupying a lot less space. Some of you may have seen the Pure Heart type of melon that's come on the market in the last 2-3 years. It's very high sugar, very thin rind, great for the benefit of the distributor and the producer. The vine of these Pure Hearts will produce about 8 or 9 fruit compared to about maybe a couple with the traditional watermelons. So one seed will produce about 4 times as many fruit per vine, and yet these are going to sell in the store for pretty much the same price as one that's 5 times the weight. They're very popular. A lot of them sell at $3.99 in the stores if you go to Wegmans, for example, now. Much more of an individual size of about 1 to 1.5 kilograms, or maybe 2 kilograms. Seedlessness is obviously a consumer trait because nobody wants to be eating a pomegranate and all they're doing is spitting out seeds. Some crops there's not really anything that you can do about it, but some crops there are, particularly the berry type crops, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when I cover fruits. But vegetables, a number of them are preferred seedless. Cucumber is typically harvested when it's young. A lot of the cucumber is parthenocarpic. This means that the flower will go on to produce the cucumber without pollination. So in greenhouse cucumber production, for example, you don't want insects in your greenhouse because those plants will go on to produce a seedless cucumber without pollination. Parthenocarpy means they don't require pollination to produce or for the ovary to develop normally. As I mentioned, seedless watermelon, which I'm going to talk about watermelon breeding a little bit more in depth when we cover polyploids in a couple of weeks. Seedless tomatoes, a surprising number of people, particularly old people, react very badly to seeds in crops like raspberries and tomatoes. They have problems with their digestive tracts. It's now possible to develop seedless tomatoes, for example, combining parthenocarpy and male sterility. The look or the appearance is also really important when we start to market these crops. So I'm really covering aspects that need to be taken into account with vegetables when we're trying to persuade consumers to consume more of them, and ideally at a higher price. In tomatoes, you can have things like a pear shape that might be interesting to some consumers. The grape tomato, which has become very popular in the last 5-10 years, get it in all your McDonald's salads now. That's been a huge market. It's basically brought the shape of the processing tomato or the Roma tomato into the cherry type or the fresh market type. Developing tomatoes that look like peppers. For people who don't really like peppers, you can then stuff the tomatoes and you can have the taste of the vegetable you want, but the look of a vegetable you don't like, perhaps. These are cucumbers. Look a little bit more like melons, but cucumbers don't have to be long and green. They can be white and small, as you can see here. So manipulation of shape, you can create essentially whole new market classes. The cluster tomato in the 90s in Europe took people by surprise. It went from a zero market to about a 40% of the entire European market in a period of about 3 or 4 years. Consumers like that on-the-vine look. When it's in the kitchen, it looks healthier. Really fitted in with the Dutch greenhouse production, which is almost organic. They'd be very difficult to produce in a field situation because obviously with the vine, you can't do any post-harvest processing with respect to pesticide residue, for example. So any pesticides you use for this should be systemic or biological. So they're probably healthier if you're concerned about those kinds of issues from a chemical standpoint. Nutrition keeps coming up, but as Henry Munger has been saying for 50 years, it's not about having a more nutritious crop, it's about encouraging people to eat more fresh produce, and then nutrition will take care of itself. I think even on that side, there's been a big advance with some of these fast food places now, where many of them sell salads, for example, so they've at least taken a partial step forward in this area. Some crops are, however, more nutritious than others. The crimson gene in tomato gives it a deeper red color. It increases the lycopene relative to beta-carotene in the vitamin A pathway, and this has anti-carcinogenic properties. Crimson tomatoes will probably be hitting the market right around now in the next 5 years, but they also look better for consumers because it gives it a deeper color in the interior. Broccoli sprouts, these have about 100 times the level of antioxidants. It looked like they may take off a few years ago, but they never really quite made it. They've been marketed by Territorial Seeds out of Oregon, I believe, and John Innes Center. Not John Innes Center, the Johns Hopkins University were involved with this. Sometimes they're actually now mixed with alfalfa sprouts, which people are more used to, and that way it increases the nutrition of sprouts that you may have on your salads by mixing them up. From a breeding point, of course, if you're growing sprouts, you have to have extremely low-cost seed production, because one seed equals one sprout, not one broccoli prune. Purple cauliflower out of Danefeld, Denmark. First really true cauliflower type in the purple background. We've had purple broccoli. Purple is oftentimes water soluble. One of the problems here is if you boil it, it's going to turn an off color. But you can stir fry it, and you can also perhaps maintain the color by steaming it. Not particularly popular, but it's one of those crops that if it's next to the white cauliflower, people will look at it and buy the white cauliflower. The orange was developed by my predecessor in Geneva, Mike Dixon. This came as a variety in the market with Seminis 2 years ago, cheddar. It's now available in a lot of stores, like Wegmans. I continue to work on it. It's a single gene, the beta gene, that disrupts the vitamin A pathway. And Lee here at the USDA has also started to look at that gene. Yep. Not really. I mean, I'm not a big cauliflower person for eating, but I think it's consumers think it looks tastier. It's kind of that yellow flesh, white flesh of peaches comparison. But it really does look nice. When you get it in the store and you put it next to the white, I mean, you naturally go for the orange color, even though it's not what is kind of in that search image for people. Britney Spears. This was at the Phelps Sauerkraut Festival a few years ago with a picture of her head stuck to a cabbage. I don't know. That's turned out to be quite an accurate representation. But a whole bunch of new crops coming on the market. Broccolini is one, combining Chinese kale and broccoli. You eat more the stem. Hasn't really taken off as much as it could. Same as broccoflower, which combined broccoli and cauliflower. Tomatillos starting to really hit the market. A lot of Mexican influence in the US in the last couple of decades. If you ever go to Mexican restaurants, the green salsa is way better than the red salsa on the flavor. And it's becoming a lot more popular. US consumers tend to like the larger fruited tomatillos. A lot of Mexicans, when they go around, they actually like the smaller ones, but there's a lot more work to harvest. They think they taste much better. Chipotle, which is another Mexican cucurbit crop that's starting to come in recently. This is a melon. Looks a little bit like a cucumber developed out of Japan. I believe you can just eat the rind on this, so you can eat the entire thing. But there's a lot of crops out there that aren't currently in the diet. I was invited out to China earlier in the year, and when they take you out for lunch or dinner in China, you tend to have very big banquets, and you only have to go to one of them to realize how many crops you've never eaten in your life. because every meal tends to have a crop that you've never seen before. So you don't necessarily have to be too clever to go out and find one. You just have to be very good at being able to market it. This is bitter melon, which is an example of an Asian crop. Dragon beans would be another one. Also, the marketing of crops becomes very important, though. Trying to sell something for what it's not. If you can do that, then you're a long way on the road to making a lot of money. Baby carrots. Some people think that these are legitimately baby carrots. Of course, they're not. They're very long, elongated carrots that are chopped up and processed to look like baby carrots. Beijing had developed these back in the 1960s, and when these hit the market in the 80s, they realized they already had a variety from 15 years ago they could use to actually process into these baby carrots. A big change in the last year or two. It's a non-patented microwavable technique from Europe. Bird's Eye have started to release steam fresh vegetables. You basically, the whole bagging process, it's like microwave popcorn, but it's microwave vegetables. It's probably going to triple the Brussels sprout market because people would not ordinarily go out and buy Brussels sprouts, but when they go and buy the steam in the bag, they might well do so. Snap beans, sweet corn, these are the kinds of crops. But the market has become huge, both here and in Europe, in a very short period of time. And probably if you go to the frozen section in the store, you'll see these. And the huge new market in these apparently hasn't made any dent in the actual sales of the vegetables. Bird's Eye, of course, sold out in New York about a year ago, thinking that this type of approach was going to be going to really hurt their industry, which has not turned out to be the case. Marketing salads with everything included. Fresh Express is another massive success story from Salinas, California, where they have all of their salads with everything in a bag. I still haven't seen these in Wegmans, but some of the ones that they do sell, if you get out to California, are really good. Turned into a company with hundreds of millions in sales very, very quickly from just combining some salad crops with some condiments and croutons. I don't have time to really talk about specific issues of my program, but basically this is the kind of diversity that we might find in the small tomato backgrounds. This is another farm with snap beans. We would grow them directly in soil, not on plastic because of the seed number. But just these are the three crops that I primarily work with, and of course cabbage. All of them have unique and different traits that need to be looked at. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of variation out there. And the old tried and tested yield, disease resistance are not the only focal points of breeding programs, particularly when you're marketing fresh market products to consumers who really respond to aesthetics. As far as basic horticulture, if you need to read up on fruits and vegetables, you can do so in Horticulture Principles and Practices. A lot of information statistically is available from USDA, National Ag Statistics. And I'll just leave you with a quote from Dan Quayle today. He's pre-Clinton, for those of you who don't remember, but he was not noted for his particular intellect. So his quote is, "It isn't pollution that's harming the environment, it's the impurities in our air and water that are doing it." It's the guy that couldn't spell potato in the classroom. But thanks for your time. I apologize for running over a couple of minutes, but I'll be back on Friday. due to the restricted time I have to cover those areas. I spoke a little bit on Wednesday about some areas of vegetable breeding, maybe some of the directions that a lot of current vegetable breeding is going in with respect to maybe more consumer traits than producer traits. The consumer traits have always been more important in the fruit crops, typically. Everybody has an opinion of what type of apple they like to eat, for example, and the quality aspects of fruit are probably a scale higher, again, than vegetables. So again, the quality issues with respect to breeding really come into play. I am a vegetable breeder, of course, so I feel somewhat like I'm a little bit cloaked when I'm talking about breeding fruit crops. But I do have 5 fruit breeding colleagues, and after 8 years of having them as colleagues, some of it does start to rub off on you at the end. So I'm just going to today talk a little bit about fruit crops and about some of the issues that can be important in fruit crop breeding. Again, when I'm talking about fruit crops, I'm really talking about the perennial type of crops. These can, of course, come in different plant types. You can have the vine types of fruit crops, like grapes. You can have the bush types of fruit crops, like berries. Or you can, of course, have the tree fruits, which are probably the most common source of the edible fruits. The fruits themselves, though, do form into different groupings. We normally associate the fleshy fruits as being the fruits. You'll all be familiar with the stone fruits, for example. You can see some plums here and some of the variation in color. But the stone fruits would include, of course, crops like peaches or cherries. But they tend to have the hard seed within the large, fleshy exterior. And I won't go in great detail into the fruit types because you cover that in the horticulture class if you take one. The berry fruits aren't necessarily what you'd consider to be a berry, perhaps in the supermarket. They're the large, fleshy fruit with interspersed seeds. So crops like a lemon or an orange or a grape could be considered a berry type of fruit for the actual fruit formation. And then we have the pome fruits, which have more of this typical core. In this group, we'd have crops like apples, apples, pears, and quince, for example. The tree fruits also include the dry fruits, like nuts, when we talk about fruits and nuts. And the dry fruits, you have probably all seen the varying types of these again. But these can be both dehiscent, which means the exterior actually splits, such as in the case here, or indehiscent, where it remains fully formed, such as a coconut. So that's just kind of some basic descriptions of the types of fleshy and dry fruits. The other 2 variations we can have on this typically is a lot of what we'd consider berry fruits in the stores. The fruit type is actually an aggregate fruit where the flower develops into multiple fruitlets. This would be the case in things like blackberries, strawberries, and raspberries. And lastly, we also have multiple fruits. In this case, multiple flowers fuse together to form one fruit, as opposed to the aggregate fruits where one flower forms multiple fruitlets. So this would include crops like pineapple and fig, for example, where multiple flowers fuse together to the one fruit. You're probably familiar with these, although I was in Wegmans a couple of weeks ago and the girl held up a pineapple and said, what is this? So if somebody can reach 18 years of old age without realizing what a pineapple is, some things never cease to amaze me. Fruit crops, they're perennial, but they're also propagated clonally. Very few fruit crops are propagated by seed. Some of the tropical fruits like papaya, maybe, but almost all fruit crops are clonally propagated. In fact, if you took seed from a fruit crop, it would be so heterozygous that the variation you would get would be considerable. If you were to take seeds from a golden delicious apple and plant them, you would not get golden delicious apple trees coming from those seeds. The fruit type follows the maternal characteristics. And so the golden delicious apple that you would eat would be the same genotype or type as the tree bearing the fruit. But when the flower is pollinated by another tree, that means that the embryo in the seed of an apple mixes the genomes of the two parents, and so if you were to plant the seed, you would get a wide variation between the pollinating plant and the tree fruit. So to maintain the type of trees, or the type of fruit crops generally, almost everything has to be clonally propagated. And this is a characteristic of plants where we're able to replicate type millions of times with very little mutation or change in the consistency or type of the fruit, for example. The asexual propagation does vary depending on what fruit crop you may be working on. In the case of strawberries, for example, it may be very different from some of the other berry crops or even from the tree fruit crops. So just to give you a quick look at what I'm talking about with this asexual propagation, in the case of strawberries, they shoot out what are known as runners. And then in nurseries, it's actually possible to start to root these. So basically, in the nursery, you will try and push the plant into producing as many runners as possible. And then these will go on to produce clonal plants of the parent. So we're really not dealing with seed at all. When we find the crop that we're interested in that has high quality, then we'd just go into asexually propagated. In the case of some of the berry crops, they might be propagated through cuttings. And these can be either stem cuttings or root cuttings. In the case of raspberries, they would be propagated through root cuttings, typically, for example. The tree fruits are a little bit more complicated. Is anybody or everybody aware of the relationship between rootstocks and scions? that occurs in tree fruits. Most of the tree fruits that are grown are actually a combination of two different plant types. You have the rootstock, which is one plant type, and then you have a completely different genotype that's grafted on top of that rootstock, which is known as the scion. This enables us to deal with a lot of problems we might encounter in agricultural practices, and it also enables us to focus breeding efforts both on the rootstock genotype and on the scion genotype. Rootstocks and scions are used in, as I say, most long-term fruit crops, including grapes and almost all of the tree fruits. In its simplest form, you can graft the scion onto a rootstock, perhaps just in a simple form like this, where you make a cut-in of the wedge and you graft it straight into the rootstock. This is just to highlight how a scion can be grafted to a rootstock. It's not necessarily typical of the methods used. The more common method is certainly the one used in apples, is known as bud grafting. And for this, you take an active bud and you can make some incision on the rootstock genotype here, and then you will graft the bud onto the rootstock type. This bud will then start to produce the scion, and when this graft has taken, you would cut the top portion of the rootstock off to allow the scion to continue to grow. I have some other slides coming up that show this in a little bit more depth. If the crop is valuable enough, and I know they've done some work on berry crops with the ability to asexually propagate through tissue culture. The crop has to have sufficient value, typically, for this to be a viable form of propagation. This is a form that's also used, for instance, in orchid propagation because of the costs of producing orchids. So the scion and rootstock relationship is really one of the most important kind of considerations in fruit breeding. It is not a new technique by any means. Romans used to graft scions and rootstocks in fruit crops, so the technique is at least 2,000 years old. We had a visitor who's worked a lot with apples and the history, and he visited from Cambridge about a year or so ago, and he was saying when the Romans went into Britain, for example, they had wild apple trees that were based there, but what they would do is they'd take the apple varieties they'd like, but they'd graft it onto the wild rootstocks that were adapted to the UK, because then the trees would grow much better within Britain, but they could still grow the varieties that they actually liked. You can oftentimes see a graft joint where the scions and the rootstocks meet. But the importance of this relationship is on multiple levels. One of the most important ones is based on the size. Rootstocks are typically developed so that when combined with the scion of the fruit variety of interest, at least in tree fruits, that they cause dwarfing of the tree. If you were to just plant an apple tree, whether it's Golden Delicious or John and Mac, the tree would become very large over a period of time. This obviously makes it very difficult for picking. And so one of the most important characteristics the rootstock provides is it reduces the size of the mature scion so that they're not only easier to harvest in the orchard, but you can also have a much higher density of trees within a certain acreage. The second very important characteristic that rootstocks provide is precociousness or juvenility. The trees oftentimes, if just planted without the rootstock, may not reach a point of effective fruit production until there may be 8 or 10 years. Obviously, if you were setting up an orchard, you don't want to have to wait a decade before you start harvesting fruit. By grafting the scion onto the rootstock, the juvenility is brought back considerably to the point where you can start harvesting fruit maybe in the 3rd or 4th year, or in some cases even the 2nd year. So you can really bring forward the time between planting and harvesting the orchard by the use of rootstocks. So this is extremely important. I mentioned also that quality is vitally important in being able to market fruit crops successfully. So most fruit breeders will focus on the quality issues of the fruit, the crispness, the sweetness, the shelf life, just the flavor qualities. But because a lot of the issues a long-term planting may encounter, especially in a variable climate like the one that we have, a lot of this can be worked with by actually developing rootstocks that are much hardier, that are more tolerant of very cold winters, for example, or that are resistant to some diseases. So if rootstocks are developed that maybe have diseases, resistance to diseases like fire blight in apples, then this disease resistance can actually be conferred through the vascular system to the scion. So developing rootstocks as a breeder, it may be possible to dwarf the tree, to increase the precociousness, bringing the harvest time forward, increase the disease resistance, and increase the environmental stress tolerance, while the breeder of the scion part focuses a lot more on issues like consumer taste, flavor, shipping, and shelf life. So the combination of the rootstock and scion can really help the production of fruit crops. Now, rootstocks are used not only in tree fruit crops, but they're also used in, for instance, vine crops. They've been examined even in a number of vegetables. Most of the greenhouse tomatoes that are grown now are grown on rootstocks. In fact, a lot of the Mexican production of tomatoes, even in tunnels and fields, is now on rootstocks. Rootstocks really help the crop if it's in the ground for a longer period of time. In the case of greenhouse tomatoes, for example, the plants can get maybe 30, 40 feet long as they use these indeterminate tomato plants that they may continue to harvest from for maybe 1 year. So in the case of tomatoes, the benefits of having them on rootstocks is that you can add some additional genetic capabilities when it comes to things like stress or maybe nematodes or diseases that you may get through the hydroponic or the soil systems. They are also examining them at the moment, I believe, in some of the melon groups. But typically they are used in fruit crops, and the development of these generally can depend on the crop type. I showed you a brief slide of the budding with apples, but before we graft those buds onto the apple rootstock genotypes, we have to, of course, produce those rootstock plants. So we can take the buds from the apple variety of interest, and then we're going to graft them onto the adventitious shoots of apples through a technique known as layering, which I will show you on the next slide. In the case of grapes, we can use direct hardwood cuttings. In some cases, the rootstocks are just developed from seed, in which case you're going to have some variability. But generally, as with the scion, you want the rootstock to be clonally propagated. The other approach that can be used is apomixis. You may have come across this term. Fruit crops are typically heterozygous, so if you were to harvest the seed and plant it, as I mentioned, you'd have a lot of variability. But apomixis is the ability for the plant to regenerate itself from the somatic cells, the somatic diploid cells, instead of the gametic embryo. And because of this, apomixis will produce clonal types of that plant. Dandelions are apomictic in your garden, as one example in nature of this occurring. So how do you produce the rootstocks for apple trees? This is achieved in stool beds in rootstock nurseries. Essentially, the rootstock genotype is laid flat along the ground. And if you've ever cut a tree down, you'll find that adventitious shoots will oftentimes come out of the ground. So basically, you're burying the apple rootstock genotype under sawdust in the stool bed, which then will send up multiple adventitious shoots out of the ground. These are then harvested, and these are going to form your rootstocks. when you go in to do the budding and grafting. So you go into harvest your adventitious shoot from the stool bed, and as I showed you the other slide, make a small incision in the stem, and then the bud of the variety, or your apple variety, is then going to be grafted to the rootstock. When the bud starts to develop into the scion, the main stem of the rootstock is removed, leaving you with the two portions of the plant, the scion and the rootstock. This is the approach that would be used in apples. In developing the rootstocks, they aren't always done in stool beds. In the case of grapes, for instance, you could just get hardwood cuttings and cause them to root. In the case of citrus, like orange, apomixis is typically the approach. The rootstocks used in oranges, they focus on genotypes that have a high degree of polyembryony. In this case, you have the fertilized zygotic embryo within the seed, but you also have somatic cells in the nucellus that basically have the somatic genotype of that maternal parent. So the ovule may be pollinated to have a combination of genotypes or combination of male and female gametes, but the cells in the nucellus are the same as the maternal plant. With polyembryony, somatic cells go on to produce young seedlings as well as the zygotic embryo. So one seed could develop into maybe 5 or 10 different seedlings coming out of the seed. These can be differentiated based on their phenotype or their morphology or size. And so it's possible then to gain clonal seedlings that have been developed from apomixis from the somatic cells of the seed. And this is often used in the case of orange. As I mentioned, in stone fruits, we sometimes actually have direct seed propagation of some of the rootstocks, which is going to produce more variability in them. Sometimes it depends on the crop type and how well they respond or what the needs are of the rootstock and the scion. So that is a very important part of fruit breeding. And I mentioned Wednesday that at Geneva, including the USDA, we have 6 plant breeders. I'm a vegetable breeder, but the other 5 breeders at Geneva are fruit breeders. We have 2 breeders that work on apples. One works on apple scions, Susan Brown. One works on apple rootstocks, Gennaro Fazio. In grapes, we have 2 breeders, Bruce Reich working on the scions and Peter Cousins working on the rootstocks. And then we also have a berry crop breeder who works on strawberries and raspberries. Strawberries don't use rootstocks, so rootstocks are typically employed in the crops that are going to have a higher degree of longevity. Some grape vineyards may be in production for 200 or 300 years. So you want something that's going to give it a good base in the soil. Outside of the scion rootstock issue, there's a lot of considerations to take into account in fruit breeding beyond breeding annual seed crops. Most plant breeding textbooks and plant breeding classes will really focus on annual seed crops and typically on agronomic or field crops. If you were to breed fruit, there's a lot of other factors that need to be taken into account. The first one is, of course, time. With the generation time of many of the tree fruit crops, the ability to make progress is really restricted. You need quite a high degree of patience for plant breeding in the first place. I'm quite an impatient person. I don't know how I ended up doing plant breeding because it's probably one of the vocations that requires one of the highest degrees of patience. But I can move quite quickly with the crops I work with. With beans, I can do 4 generations in 1 year. In many fruit crops, you couldn't do 4 generations in a decade. Some of the fruit breeders will tell you that the benefit of taking a job as a fruit breeder is by the time people realize you don't know what you're doing, it's time to retire. So part of the consideration is that a lot of what you're going to work with for the majority of your career is perhaps what your predecessor had developed. Because if you take a job as a fruit breeder, by the time you start to know what you're doing and you start to move those genotypes ahead, you may be 15 years, 20 years into your career. Which can be complicated if, for instance, you're trying to do graduate studies in fruit breeding also. Not that you won't have good materials to work on, but you very much rely on materials that may have been generated 5 or 10 years before your arrival, and they may not directly suit the project that you're working on. The time issues also probably affect the market economics and the private investment in fruit crops. Most fruit crop breeding is done in the public sector, whether it's by universities or the USDA. There are very few fruit breeding programs in the private sector, and the fruit programs that exist in the private sector are typically on the short generation fruit crops like strawberries. There are some also private programs for grape breeding, for example, but there's very few private programs for tree fruit breeding, for example. And this is because by the time you make your investment, but it may take 20 years before you see anything out of your investment if you to start to develop a new program. The space issue is another factor. I mentioned that we have about 750 acres at Geneva, or about 300 hectares. Probably 80% of this is taken up with the tree fruit crops. This is another great benefit of the rootstocks in being able to control the size and the number of trees that you can put in a particular acreage. But the space issues are not the only factor here. It's also, of course, the cost issues. If you go and plant 10 acres a year for your career, by the time you're 20 years into your career, you're going to have a lot of trees that you need to be looking at. showed this slide again, but precociousness, as I mentioned, is very important in fruit crops. If you identify an extremely high quality apple, but to commercially produce it, you're not going to be able to harvest it for 10 years. That's going to be a real problem economically. So the ability to be able to harvest in a shorter period of time is very important. With some crops, depending on where you're from, the age of the crop will also be linked to the quality of it. The French will tell you that a grapevine does not produce high quality grapes until it's 20 years old. But almost every grapevine in the Finger Lakes region is probably less than 10 years of age, so it's obviously less important here than it is in France. The labor costs also become very important. Oftentimes, crews are employed from Mexico that will come and pick the fruit in the New York region, for example. But issues like the maturity of the crop really need to be taken into account here. Because if you're going to have a crew of people come in to pick apples, you don't want all of the apples that are ready for picking in the same week. So typically you will produce varieties that have different maturities. So you'll start off with earlier maturing varieties like Ginger Gold that may be ready for picking in mid-September, and then move through to later maturing apples so that you can pick different varieties of apples from your orchard over a period of maybe 5 or 6 weeks. If you had to pick everything in the first week, then it would be very, very difficult to do business at all. But we also need to take into account issues like the maybe thorns that may exist. If you've ever gone out and picked crops like raspberries or wilder kind of blackberry type crops, these make it very difficult on a labor basis for picking efficiently. So thornless varieties are perhaps a trait that would be very important. A lot of wild orange trees are very thorny. Height is also a real issue from a density per acre issue and from a picking point again. So a lot of this comes down to effective production of crops, and breeding has to be targeted not just about the quality of the crop, but about the morphology in size and maturity and juvenility to allow efficient production of the crops. Pest resistance, as I mentioned, is also important, but perhaps in the longer term crops like the tree fruits, a lot of that can actually be focused on the rootstock genotype without taking away from the quality issues of the scion. All of this at the end of the day comes down to marketing issues and being able to get a higher price as you can for everything. If you can get a novel crop into the marketplace, you can get a higher price for it. If you go to Wegmans and look at Honeycrisp, you'll probably find that it costs $2.49 a pound. If you find some other apple varieties, then maybe $1.59 a pound. That's because Honeycrisp is a relatively new and relatively popular apple, and so the availability of it is quite low. 5 years from now, it'll cost the same price as everything else because so many people have planted this variety that in 5 years there'll be an extreme excess of it, likely. It was developed out of Minnesota, out of the university program there. Apple as a crop, has a number of issues, as do any individual fruit crop types. It has severe inbreeding depression, which means if you're looking at population development, you really can't self-pollinate an apple. You can self-pollinate self-incompatible plant types. There's techniques that can be employed to overcome self-incompatibility. But fruit crops typically are very heterozygous compared to annual seed crops. And because they're very heterozygous, they have a lot of deleterious recessive genes that can be brought out, but the inbreeding depression is severe. Also, because of the age, you want to do as much seedling pre-selection as you possibly can. But issues like the scions in rootstocks, the juvenility and size, as I mentioned, are very important, but also is name recognition. There are not that many crops where people know the crop by its name. Some people might see different types. They may see cluster tomatoes, beefsteak tomatoes, Rin hybrids, but there's very few crops where they're actually known by name. It's the case for wine grapes, it's the case for apples. And people have their favorite types. Many apple trees are actually triploid. It's not that triploids are, it's not that triploids harvest more, but they tend to have bigger fruit. And I'll actually go into that a lot more a week on Monday when I talk about polyploids and the combinations in that area and how you would deal with triploids in a production system, for that matter. I left about 3 or 4 apples on the back. I'm talking about germplasm on Monday, but I've talked quite a lot about different colors, etc., that can be used. This is an example of an apple that you might use in a breeding program. You're welcome to try them at the back. But it has deep red flesh on the interior. So, as a breeder, if you want to go and create a whole new market class and category of apples, you might be able to take something like this and produce an apple type for the consumer, but it might also take you 40 or 50 years. It has been attempted a little bit in New Zealand. It's not there yet, but maybe 30 years ago, the consumer wasn't even ready for a product like this. Now the consumer's a lot more accepting to different shapes, colors, sizes, and packaging. And we're now at a point where an apple with a deep red flesh like this could be extremely popular in the marketplace. Unfortunately, you're not going to market an apple that's this size. Just to mention a couple of other popular crops quite quickly. Orange, as we know it, really wasn't described until about 1400. It has been documented back 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. But the older oranges that were documented were sour oranges. So they were probably more like the lemons and the limes in taste than they are today. The oranges grown by Romans, for example, would have been the sour orange type. The sweet orange only really started to get mentioned about 1400 in Europe, and now that accounts, of course, for most of the oranges that are sold in supermarkets. If you go down to Florida, the types of oranges are going to vary. The more round types are known as Valencias. If you have the navel at the base, it's going to be a navel orange. You might also have seen the blood oranges that have the deeper red kind of interior. These are also going to vary a little bit in their maturity. They're a subtropical type of crop, very susceptible to frost damage, for example. So producing different orange types like Navels and Valencias will enable you again to expand out your picking season for labor issues. Grapefruit is another relatively new crop. This arose in somewhere in Jamaica in the 1700s, and it's thought to have been a cross that occurred naturally between pomelo and orange. So people, of course, had moved orange trees to Jamaica, and you get some natural insect pollination. So a pollination event occurred, the seed grew up into a tree somewhere in Jamaica, and then somebody found the grapefruit and decided to clonally propagate it. Most changes in grapefruit since that point, because it was essentially developed from a single plant or single source, have been mutations that have occurred in production environments, producing such things as the pink type, the seedless type, or the more of the red grapefruit type. Now, it is possible to recreate crosses between orange and pomelo, for example, and try to expand the germplasm, but a lot of improvements in grapefruit have not been through crossing, they've been through mutation. Because of the clonal capabilities of fruit crops, it's possible to find something once and then have worldwide production and distribution. Until recently, almost every kiwi fruit on the planet was produced from a single plant, until they started recently to develop the golden and the red kiwi fruit types. And now there's quite a big breeding effort going on in Tauranga in New Zealand. Grapefruit, until probably about the 1970s as well, used to be treated with arsenic to bring up the production time. Something that the more senior grapefruit eaters might have been exposed to. Another one I'll mention, just because it's one that's focused at Cornell, is strawberry. Typically in California, where most of the strawberry production is, these are grown as annuals on plastic beds. The annual types are going to be day neutral, which means that when you plant the runner, it grows up into a plant, and at a certain point in its maturity, it'll produce fruit, irrespective of the day length. In areas like the Northeast or in New York, most of the strawberries grown are perennials, so every year they're mowed down and they come back. And perennial crops, the fruiting will be typically day sensitive. So it's possible to spread out the picking season or the harvesting season by selecting differences in day sensitivity in a perennial crop. So if something's pushed into fruiting with a little bit of a shorter day as you're coming into summer, then that will be earlier maturing, for example. So you can actually increase the length of the growing season by manipulating both planting time with day neutral types or the response to day length in the day sensitive perennial types. Many fruit crops are polyploid. In the case of strawberries, they are octoploid. Oftentimes wild crop species can be found. So the wild strawberries will oftentimes be diploid. And while I'll talk about polyploidy a week on Monday, one thing that occurs in polyploidy typically is an increase in cell size, which has a corresponding increase in, for example, seed size or fruit size. So when you're going out and looking for mutations that you can clonally propagate, if fruit crops become polyploid, from a diploid to a tetraploid, from a tetraploid to an octoploid, one of the consequences of this can oftentimes be an increase in fruit size. So when you see the wild strawberries as diploids with a very small fruit, the fact they're octoploid could be that just these natural polyploidization events occur, and then people just select the larger fruit and they clonally propagate the larger fruited plants. I'll just finish off quickly with grapes. Obviously, this has a lot of name recognition to it. Probably the most widely grown variety is Thompson seedless. I believe this is used for raisins as well as table grapes. New York, more American-based grapes, Nebraska-type grapes are grown like Concord, Niagara. Concord's used for Welch's grape juice and for some of the cheaper, sweeter wines, or as a mixer. Typically, the European types or the vinifera types are now grown. They're less winter hardy. They're less tolerant to downy mildew and nematodes. But now, of course, you have a lot of consumer preference towards particular wine grape types. Most of the wine grape varieties were produced 200 or more years ago. But as with cheeses having names like cheddar and Stilton, it's the same with wines. People are very, very slow to change to a new wine grape variety. So the grape varieties like Chardonnay or Merlot or Pinot Noir that are oftentimes grown at the wineries may have been developed in the 16 or 1700s or even prior to that. Some of the newer ones include grape types like Cayuga White that was developed out of Geneva. But seedlessness is important. This can be dictated by a genetic basis, stenospermocarpy, where the embryos are bought without producing seeds. You can also generate seedlessness through triploids or aneuploidy. I should also say that most grapes for consumption in stores are also treated with growth hormones to increase their size considerably. But they are also crops that depend a lot on the rootstock situation. This is used to help reduce problems such as nematodes and phylloxera. If you're walking through the grapeyard, sometimes you'll see these kind of natural mutations. So if you wonder the difference between Pinot Noir and Pinot Blanc, it's that somebody's grown Pinot Noir and then they find a white grape among that stuff and they just clonally propagate the white grape and you've got a whole new grape variety. Tropical fruits don't typically fall into a lot of the categories of temperate fruits, but they are more equatorial, typically highly sensitive to frost, but would include crops like pineapple, banana, papaya, mango that you can see here. And then this is just a list of some of the issues that you may see as more prevalent in vegetable crops and more prevalent in fruit crops, which I have given you on the handouts. If you want some more information on fruit breeding, if you happen to be doing it for your thesis, these are two reasonable sources that you can go to.